Tracy Rosenthal, Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. Delve into the reality of the American housing crisis with Tracy Rosenthal's Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. This book unmasks the systemic challenges faced by tenants and highlights the harsh truths of a rental system that prioritizes profit over people. As we unpack the historical and modern factors contributing to the plight of renters across the nation, you'll discover how tenants historically built the vibrant communities we cherish, despite being marginalized. This journey through decades of policy decisions and economic shifts sheds light on the power dynamics that keep tenants vulnerable and underrepresented. Prepare for an insightful exploration of grassroots movements and collective tenant actions, culminating in a bold vision for housing justice that seeks not merely to reform but to revolutionize our conception of community and sovereignty over land.
Housing reality check. Picture this as a capitalist fairy tale. Rental housing is a generous service offered by landlords, where tenants easily afford rent and live securely while saving to eventually buy their own homes. Landlords, in turn, make a reasonable profit. However, the reality flips this fairy tale on its head. In the United States, keeping up with rent can demand up to 4 full-time minimum wage jobs for a standard 2-bedroom unit. This is the harsh circumstance faced by 100 million tenants, who often spend over a third, or even half, of their income on housing. In cities like Los Angeles, some tenants struggle even more, with 90% of their income devoted to rent. Meanwhile, landlords initiate 7 evictions every minute, contributing to the nearly 750,000 Americans without shelter. This isn't simply a failed system, it works precisely as intended, with landlords pocketing over $4.5 trillion in profits in the 2010s alone. The crisis stems not from housing shortages but from structural imbalances that destabilize tenants' lives. These inequalities spring from wealth extraction and authority rooted in real estate, where land, a shared resource, is privatized, and housing, a fundamental need, is exploited. Such dynamics sustain landlords' passive income on the back of tenant labor. Communities aren't built by those who profit from them but by the tenants themselves, like the lively black communities in 1920s Harlem or the vibrant queer communities in 1960s Castro. Yet, the siphoning of rent supports ongoing segregation and inequality. True housing justice emerges by acknowledging tenants as the genuine creators and defenders of their vibrant communities. Unraveling America's housing dilemma. America's housing story begins with a legacy of exploitation, as indigenous peoples were stripped of their lands. Over the years, policy decisions have culminated in a severe housing crisis, disproportionately affecting tenants. The saga took a pivotal turn in the 1930s when President Herbert Hoover deemed homeownership vital for economic prosperity. Yet, the Great Depression upended this vision, leaving countless Americans jobless and homeless. Hoover's policies favored potential homeowners, neglecting the plight of renters. Subsequent shifts under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal fortified this focus on homeownership, prioritizing long-term, fixed-interest loans. These measures overlooked and perpetuated racial exclusion, particularly against Black Americans. Realtors, enforcing a decades-long code of ethics, systematically sidelined non-white families to protect property values. Redlining practices denied essential mortgage access to Black and immigrant neighborhoods, cementing racial divides. Exclusionary zoning laws compounded these challenges, with property in predominantly white areas receiving inflated valuations. While the New Deal introduced public housing as a safeguard against predatory landlords, vested real estate interests limited its scope. Public housing was forced into being a haven of the last resort, leaving many tenants languishing in dire conditions. By the 1950s, a rhetoric emerged painting public housing as a socialist threat, reinforcing private homeownership ideals that prioritized individual property over community needs. Post-World War II suburban expansion reshaped the American housing landscape, transforming common lands into single-family dwellings. This trend fueled consumer culture and reinforced traditional gender norms while draining urban centers of valuable resources. Urban tenants found themselves trapped in deteriorating environments as suburban taxpayers fled. The housing policies of the 1980s, particularly under Ronald Reagan, have enduring impacts. The low-income housing tax credit was designed to encourage affordable housing but primarily advantaged private developers. Temporary rent controls did little to stabilize the market. Concurrently, deep cuts to the housing and urban development budget further eroded support for renters. This period also saw a surge in imprisonment due to aggressive policing tactics like broken windows, which targeted minor crimes prevalent in urban, economically disadvantaged areas. The resultant rise in private prisons increased housing insecurity for the formerly incarcerated, who faced housing discrimination upon release. The 2008 subprime mortgage crisis escalated these tensions, forcing large numbers into renting as foreclosures mounted. Predatory lending shattered many dreams of homeownership, flooding the rental sector. In the 2000s and beyond, urban gentrification ignited as developers returned, displacing long-established communities and inflating rents. Once again, tenants found themselves vulnerable in an economic system crafted to prioritize profits over the provision of stable, affordable housing. This ongoing housing crisis extends beyond mere supply and demand concerns. It is a deep-rooted tenants crisis, resulting from deliberate policy choices and systemic exploitation. Power in unity. Tenants can often feel trapped amidst rising rents, neglectful landlords, and the constant fear of eviction, yet an incredibly effective weapon lies within their grasp: the rent strike. By banding together and striking, tenants are able to coerce landlords into negotiating fairer terms. A striking example of this occurred in 2017 on 2nd Street, Los Angeles, under the leadership of Alejandro Juarez. Juarez faced a crippling rent increase from $840 to $1,495 per month following a change in ownership. Although permissible as the building was beyond rent control protections, it was unsustainable for many tenants who feared future hikes. Seeking a solution, Juarez enlisted support from Elizabeth Blaney of the LA Tenants Union, LATU. Encouraged by Blaney, he organized a meeting for his fellow tenants, many of whom met each other for the first time. This newfound unity revealed common bonds. Many were immigrants, and several were mariachi musicians contributing to the local culture at Mariachi Plaza. Together, they resolved to act as one. The landlord, capitalizing on the local cultural allure, marketed luxury refurbished apartments, rebranding the area as Mariachi Crossing, yet systematically displaced the musicians integral to its charm. Initial meetings with the property manager to address issues such as mold and leaks were fruitless, as explanations given were tied to covering the purchase cost. Determined, the tenants identified the owner, Frank Turner, recognized for marketing non-rent-controlled apartments in anticipation of local development. When requests for dialogue went unanswered, they intensified their efforts. Signs were posted, a press conference held at Mariachi Plaza, and tenants educated themselves on their organizing rights, including the First Amendment and the right to livable conditions. Despite continual landlord disregard, the tenants withheld rent collectively, demonstrating their unity. Attempts to divide them with individual deals were rebuffed, and when eviction proceedings began, their legal representation delayed outcomes. They insisted on collective negotiations rather than individual settlements. After nearly a year, the landlord yielded under pressure from public and media support and formalized a deal with the tenants. The agreement included 6 months of rent forgiveness, a significant reduction in increases, a cap on future hikes, and promised repairs. This outcome underscores the precarious balance in landlord-tenant relationships, demonstrating that strategic, collective action can secure meaningful victories. Rent strikes not only yield concessions but also strengthen tenant organizations, empowering community members to assert their rights and demand better living standards. Housing revolution from within. Imagine tenants standing united, wielding the power of collective action to challenge the exploitative practices of landlords and developers. The fight for housing goes beyond short-lived victories. it demands a recognized right to secure housing for everyone, regardless of their financial situation, a right glaringly absent from U.S. law and the current housing system. Many might assume that electing representatives who prioritize tenant rights would suffice to overhaul housing policies. Unfortunately, this approach often proves futile. Political scandals involving real estate industry bribery are not uncommon, with influential bodies like the California Association of Realtors exerting substantial control. Despite representing the majority, tenants seldom occupy these corridors of power, leaving political change an elusive goal within the existing structures. However, there is a more potent path: grassroots organizing. The dominance of landlords and developers thrives on the fragmented struggles of individual tenants battling alone. Transforming this landscape requires a unified front through tenants' unions, anchored in 5 core principles to amplify their collective strength. The first principle underscores building community. Tenants frequently face common challenges, from leaky sinks to soaring rents. By organizing as a community, they can pool resources, watch out for each other, and foster systems of mutual support. Secondly, tenants must create units of power. This involves crafting vertical structures, such as building-based unions to champion rights locally, alongside horizontal structures that connect communities citywide or regionally. These synergies combat broader threats like gentrification and instability. Next, reclaiming space emerges as a dynamic form of resistance. Tenants occupying their living spaces isn't merely about averting evictions, it's about cultivating a communal presence. Hosting events in shared areas, like lobby meetings or block parties, as well as nurturing community gardens, reinforces ownership and connectivity to these spaces. The fourth principle is experimentation and continuous learning. Tenants' unions should orchestrate workshops focusing on rights and injustices, embracing non-hierarchical learning models that encourage everyone to contribute and evolve. Lastly, perseverance is crucial. While collective organizing is a gradual process marred with setbacks, the vision of a fair housing system sustains the movement. Despite evictions or individual losses, the struggle for universal housing rights remains an imperative and inspiring pursuit. Reclaiming home. In the vibrant community of Boyle Heights, tenants at an East 2nd Street apartment transformed their garden into a nurturing center of mutual support. Beneath avocado trees, they distribute fresh food to those in need, cultivating not just plants but a spirit of shared resilience. This budding community effort, however, faced backlash from their landlord, who erected barriers to suppress this collective energy, underscoring how tenant solidarity threatens the profit-centric motives entrenched in the housing market. For landlords and investors, buildings are mere assets on a spreadsheet, but for tenants, these spaces are a foundation for community and resistance. Such collective efforts challenge the notion of commodified housing, prioritizing belonging and empowerment over financial exploitation. The goal isn't to swap roles and become property owners. Instead, tenants aim to dismantle the binding chains of insecurity linked with renting. This struggle is more than improving living conditions, it's about redefining the relationship we share with the land. Tenants fight not just for better apartments, but to reclaim their homes as spaces free from financial grips. If housing justice is to be achieved, it requires reshaping societal norms around land ownership and exploitation. Through their determined actions, tenants not only better their own lives but revolutionize the concept of neighborhood living.
Rosenthal's Abolish Rent presents a compelling case for why the housing crisis is a symptom of deeper systemic exploitation, where tenants are systematically marginalized and oppressed. The narrative emphasizes that real change is driven not by waiting for political leaders, but through the collective power of tenants organizing and advocating for their rights. By highlighting historical examples, such as the transformative rent strikes and community building initiatives, the book demonstrates how unity and proactive engagement can lead to significant victories. This book ultimately champions the cause of redefining home and community, encouraging readers to envision a housing system where security and belonging are fundamental rights, not privileges dictated by economic disparity. As you close this summary, consider the transformative potential of tenant solidarity, and the imperative of striving for housing justice that respects and elevates communal and individual dignity alike.